this presentation or need a moment for yourself. So I want to do a little reflection moment. So imagine for yourself and silently reflect, what is the visual that comes to your mind when you think of a disabled person? So what does that person look like? What is that person doing? What is that person using? And the context behind that. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to kind of just sit there and think about it. Now I want you to start to wonder, where does this perception come from? Is this from a movie that you've seen, a TV show, someone that you've interacted with, or maybe you don't know if you've ever interacted with a disabled person? Just kind of think on that for a little bit. Perfect. So to give you an understanding of what our presentation objectives are today is, at the end of this, I would love for y'all to be able to understand what being disabled means and the difference between visible and invisible disabilities. How to safely advocate for yourself and others for equitable spaces and to use inclusive language. To understand ADA laws in terms of disability rights. To understand navigating workplace accommodations and that process. To have an understanding of community resources to further practice self-autonomy, and to learn to practice self-care in this autonomization. So before we delve in, here are some common terms. So feel free to read them out. So we have ableism, ableist microaggressions, accessible, and ADA. So I will give you a few seconds. ADA is a really big one that's going to be coming up. So that is Americans with Disability Act. And that is a federal law that gave a lot of protection, or basically gave all the protections to people with disabilities, and was a huge step, which is why we're having Disability Pride Month again. Yeah. Okay. So what is considered a disability in the US? So according to the Americans with Disability Act, which is our federal law that we use as a guiding principle for understanding the protections that we are given, they define it as a person with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a history or record of such impairment, such as cancer that is in remission, or is perceived by others as having such an impairment, such as a person who has scars from a severe burn. And don't worry, we'll break this down even more. So now, what does any of that mean? So in terms of disability protection under ADA law, it's very vague, and it does not intend to offer a specific standard for the life limitations or the life impact that a disabled person has. So when it says the wording of substantially limit a major life activity, this can range from an internal process such as the psyche or to a physical limitation. So some examples provided by the ADA are actions like eating, sleeping, walking, movements, cognitive functions, tasks like working, reading, or operation of a bodily function like circulation, reproduction, and individual organs. So it has a wide range of applicable things that fall into this limitation of a major life activity. And still kind of confusing, I understand. So, and the other part of having a history of a record of an impairment is also protected under ADA. So this means that if you had cancer and you are in remission, you are still protected, even though you do not actively have that right now. If you also are perceived as a person who has a disability, that further clarifies that someone who may or may not have the impairment but is subject to discrimination for others' beliefs that they do is also protected under ADA. But the caveat here is that the ADA does not offer protection to impairments that are transitionary or minor, which means that it does not last this condition for greater than 6 months. Okay, so now we can talk about invisible versus visible disabilities. So invisible disabilities is a commonly coined term that used to describe disabilities that are not visible from the outside. So if we think back about our reflection from earlier at the beginning of this presentation, I can make an assumption here that a lot of people's perceptions of someone with a disability refers to someone using assistive equipment, such as a wheelchair, a walker, or a guide dog. However, in recent surveys, and this one was only in 1994, there have been more frequent ones, they found that only 26% of the 1 in 10 Americans that have a disability use assistive equipment such as wheelchairs, canes, crutches, or a walker. So that really narrows down the scope of how many people have visible equipment that can be seen in society to substantiate the claim of their disability. However, a lot of disabilities are not visible. So some examples can include debilitating pain, fatigue, dizziness, and these are some of the symptoms of having, an invisible disability that may not be visible to the naked eye, but are still impacting the major life actions of that person, such as those that qualify under the ADA law. So what is the impact of the visible versus invisible disabilities? So opening up the dialogue and increasing the understanding of the variability of disabilities helps destigmatize and relieves expectation for disabled people to have to take on the burden to continually educate people without disabilities. For myself, with a service dog, I appear as if I do not have a disability. It is not visible, so I would often get a lot of questions as to why do you need a service dog, or how did you lie so that I can also get a service dog? So there was that assumption that I was just skirting the system in order to just bring my dog with me everywhere. And having that expectation of me to have to educate this person as to, no, not all disabilities are visible, or I actually don't owe you an explanation for my disability. Because a lot of people do, you're sharing a medical diagnosis, and not every stranger that you encounter necessarily needs to be privy to that information, nor is it the person who is disabled's responsibility to have to educate. So being a true ally takes the understanding of the impacts of living with a disability to include the intersectional understanding of those lived experiences as well. So while you may be disabled, you may also be a trans disabled individual, and how that plays an impact on how you are navigating the space. Or you may be a person of color, and how that further implicates the reactions and the reception you were receiving from the general community as well. So language is really important. So this is some language from a disability rights activist and disabled writer themselves, Emily. And I want to caveat this by saying that it is always best, if you are referring to a specific person, to ask them what terms are reflective of their lived experience and their identity. So this is not a catch-all list, and sometimes people may have preferences as to what they prefer. But in a general sense, I want us to understand that disability or disabled is not a bad word. It is not a bad thing. So languages that we can use are disability, disabled, versus differently abled or handy-capable. Person with disabilities, disabled person, yes, versus handicapped, special needs. Another version, has a disability, is disabled, versus afflicted by, suffers from, victim of, where it kind of takes away the power and autonomy this person has and puts them in a victim stance. Whereas a lot of people feel empowered. They feel that connection with their disability. It doesn't make them less than. And the same regards to terms like high functioning or low functioning. versus a person who is able to, a person who is unable to, a person with high support needs, as opposed to leveling and quantifying a person's functionality. So another process with living with a disability is navigating the workplace. And part of this is with requesting workplace accommodations. So a person with a disability is able to start what is called the informal interactive process with their employer to give you to implement a change or adjustment at your work due to your medical condition. So this can be done verbally, but it is best to have a paper trail of requests and discussions in case there's ever a dispute about accommodations. In my experience, having very thorough documentations, emails, and receipts of conversations, next steps, and guidance has been really helpful in the accountability factor, because a lot of employers do not understand ADA laws, nor do they have an understanding of how to best support their disabled employees. And so some employers may have their own forms for you to fill out, and they may ask for you to provide additional documentation to see that your disability does meet the criteria for an ADA definition of disabled. So I understand that this can be a totally